Hello, and welcome back to Dornsife Dialogues. Today's discussion will explore the very essence of our existence, the subjective experience of being aware of ourselves and the world around us. Some argue that consciousness is a purely physical phenomenon, emerging from the complex interactions of neurons in the brain. Others propose that there is something more to it, something that cannot be explained by our current understanding of the natural world. Descartes, in his singular way, said that consciousness is irrefutable because it's something that comes from within. Of course, Descartes wasn't reckoning with the AI revolution that we find ourselves in. Within the past few months, the public has gotten a first look at a whole new level of AI technology. These new generative AI systems are certainly not conscious in a human way, but their behavior has already made us think hard about what their effect on society could be in the very near future. Fortunately, we have experts here with us today who will shed light on the implications of our new AI friends, on the nature of consciousness, and what it means to be sentient. Today's discussion will be moderated by cognitive neuroscientist Jonas Kaplan, Associate Professor of Research at USC's Brain and Creativity Institute, and co-director of the Dana and David Dornsife Cognitive Neuroimaging Center. Jonas's work explores issues relating to consciousness, identity, empathy, and social relationships. He also hosts the podcast Float with filmmaker Mary Sweeney, which explores the creative place where art and science meet. So let's get into it. I'll hand things over to Jonas, who will introduce our panelists. And thank you, as always, for tuning in.
Thank you, Dean Miller, for that excellent introduction, and thank you all for being here today, and especially to our speakers, Professor Antonio Damasio and Tok Thompson. I'm going to introduce our speakers first. Antonio Damasio is the David Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience. He's the director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC Dornsife, and he's the author of numerous books, including Descartes' Error, The Strange Order of Things, and most recently, Feeling and Knowing, Making Minds Conscious. We also have with us today Tok Thompson, Professor of Anthropology and Communication at UNC Dornsife. He's the author of the book Posthuman Folklore, which explores new concepts of personhood, and also the truth of myth, which explores how fundamental narratives shape how we think of the world. Thank you both for being here with us today. I want to start this discussion by just talking about what consciousness actually is. This is titled The Enigma of Consciousness, and the word itself turns out to be something of an enigma that people can't agree upon. So before we talk about all these different things like consciousness and mind, I want to get your views on what exactly these words mean. So let's start with you, Antonio. How do you define consciousness?
Well, I think the different definitions of consciousness depending on the point of view. My definition that comes from my work as a neuroscientist, as a psychologist in general, is quite different from the conventional definitions that you have in day-to-day life. And that's actually one of the problems. So a lot of people, when they hear the word consciousness, they first think of mind. So they think about this marvelous space that we have where our perceptions, our reasonings, the translations of our perceptions, for example, of objects and actions in words, where all of that is happening. And that is really mind, but mind itself is not consciousness. But that's certainly one of the very common things that will come to anyone's mind when you hear the word consciousness. Then there's another use of the term, which is very, very conventional, which has to do with collective knowledge. So, for example, one could say something like the celebrations of the 4th of July are part of the American consciousness. And of course, what we mean there is something has to do with history, has to do with the accumulation of knowledge in the history, for example, of a group. But that's one way in which consciousness is very often taken. And something I must warn you about is the confusion between the word consciousness and the word conscience. So very often people think of consciousness as something has to do with a moral sense, rather than the true, real consciousness that we're going to talk about in a minute. So all of these different meanings have to be excluded once we really get into the nitty-gritty of consciousness from a psychological point of view or from the neuroscientific point of view. And that's what I'm going to give you right now. And that, for me, it has to do with experience. It has to do with the possibility that we have of having any of the contents of our mind be perceived, be taken in the perspective of ourselves. So you have an experience of your life going on in your organism. You have an experience of thoughts that are in your mind, and that experience has a perspective. And that perspective traditionally is the perspective of the self. So we have to assume there is this magic construction in our minds / brains / living organisms, which is the creation of a perspective, the creation of a self-experiencer, and all the materials that are in that mind have that perspective. So right now, for example, I'm looking at the screen where I actually see Tok, I see Jonas, I see myself, and all of that is indelibly coming from me and into me. And something that is quite curious and that people don't realize is that the grounding for this possibility of experience, this possibility of perspective, is actually within our very life. So, and within feeling itself. So as our life continues, we are constantly having feelings that have to do with our own organism. It's quite curious because the main feeling that we have, and we're hardly aware of it, is the feeling of our own life, sort of continuing in the organism, the feeling that I like to call the feeling of existence. But then there are many other feelings of which we are, again, not quite aware, but they are providing us with the grounds for consciousness, and they include the feeling of body temperature, the feeling of breath going on, the feeling of our heart beating. And what is so interesting is that when something goes wrong with those systems, we immediately become very aware of them. Take body temperature. If you have the flu or if you have COVID and your temperature goes up, you immediately become aware of it quite noticeably. But otherwise, you're not aware of the feeling of your body temperature. But all of those feelings constitute the background for what really is consciousness. So you have a word that is filled with meaning, quite different depending on the constituencies that you're dealing with. And it's something that you need to be quite aware of, otherwise you get into enormous confusions. But the good news, and I'll close with this, the good news is that right now, with the kind of research that we do in neuroscience, in biology in general, we are getting a purchase on how this is really happening. And one last note for you. It's quite common to say that, well, consciousness, scientifically speaking, comes from the brain. And in fact, there's a famous hard problem of consciousness that asks itself, how is it possible that this physical organ called the brain generates consciousness or generates mind and consciousness, which are supposedly immaterial? Well, the good news that I can tell you is that it's not about brains alone. You don't create consciousness with brains alone. You create consciousness with a partnership between the brain, the nervous system, and the rest of the living organism. The brain is a late comer in the history of life. Before you have brains, you have living organisms, and that's very important to remember. But I'll stop right there. Talk.
So that's a very biological perspective. Tok, as an anthropologist, how does the way you view consciousness overlap or differ from that?
Well, I think one of the main points is that, what does the word mean? Well, we create meaning, right? Words don't come with meanings built into them. So it's the meanings that we put on these words and then what people do with those. But at an elemental level, I think what I would agree that we're looking at, if you want to get to the basics of consciousness, don't start with people. We're pretty complex. You can start with slime molds, right? These are unicellular organisms that can choose, that can figure out little puzzles and pathways, that can remember. So, you know, I think that's a big point, is to remember how biological a process consciousness is. That this has been developing for a long, long time on planet Earth. So people sometimes, you know, the theory of mind, do you recognize that you exist, or do you recognize that other organisms exist? That's something that people sometimes talk about consciousness, self-consciousness, being conscious of oneself. And again, you know, this can get more complex from slime molds, to be sure. One of the things about Homo sapiens sapiens is we like to tell stories. And so we narrate these things, and that gives you sort of a different sort of narrative consciousness, right? We walk around with these little autobiographies in our mind, or, you know, who you think you are very often is built out of stories: the story of my people, the story of the human race, the story of me. So there's other ways that we can, you know, think about different forms of consciousness. But at the elemental level, you know, it's an organism that has to feel, that has to decide, and that's true with the slime mold, and it's true with us. So we're working with the very basics of biology itself. But if I could say just a couple of words on words, because these do come up, you know, what do you mean with consciousness? What is this thing called the mind? Is there a thing called the mind? I think that's you know, we can't weigh it, we can't touch it, we've never felt it. Is it a thing, or is it basically a amorphous concept, or a metaphor, or simply a non-existent thing? You know, for Descartes, we were talking about Descartes' error, and of course, this is really important to recognize that our Western society was built on this, and we get our ideas of the mind very often from Descartes, the idea of the mind-body split. And he used the word, as Professor Damasio pointed out in his work on him, he used the word mind and soul sort of interchangeably. For him, these were pretty much the same thing. The soul was the mind, this was the spirit. Freud wanted to call it the psyche. But you know, what do these different words mean? What are their different connotations? And so again, we're working with right now with one particular language, or at least with an Indo-European tradition. And we can build back from that all the way, I would say, back to mythology, right? Where did Descartes get his ideas of the mind? From the Christian ideas of the soul. Where did Christian ideas of the soul come from? And then all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so in different mythological traditions and different linguistic traditions, you're going to have different, you know, basic categorical principles that, you know, imply different sort of questions and ways of thinking about things. That's one of the reasons I've been very inspired by Native American mythological traditions, is because Native American philosophical traditions never made Descartes' error, right? They never thought there was a mind-body split. And so there's different ways to tease out these through these different stories and languages and concepts that are often built into those words. So that's always a key concern. What does the word mean? Well, we create meaning, and we wrestle with this socially speaking. So that's what we're doing right now, right? We're creating meaning.
Antonio, is the mind real, even though we can't see it and touch it and weigh it?
I would say yes. I would say yes. I think the fact that we cannot touch it or weigh it is no big problem. There's plenty of reality, of physical reality that we can't touch or see, and yet it's there, and it's doing pretty good things. Like, for example, allowing the communication that we're having right now. We're all in different places, and the physics of the systems that we're using to communicate allow us to be all in the same space, or to appear to be all in the same space for a moment. Something that Tok said is very interesting is the fact, which I like very much, you related, of course, life to very simple organisms. You know, we have, you know, the most numerous organisms on Earth are actually unicellular organisms. Many of them without even a nucleus, and yet they have an intelligence. They are capable of making quote unquote choices, not choices in the same way we do, because there's nothing in them that permits internal observation of facts or a decision among facts that compete, and yet they make these decisions automatically. What is very interesting, and this is one of the main issues in current research on the topic of consciousness, is to what degree you can even say that they have consciousness, or to which degree you can say that they have minds. I prefer to say that they don't. I prefer to say that they have an enormous intelligence that is not minded, but where in fact there are many of the intentions that will become clear once we have minds and once we have consciousness. So for example, in those simple living creatures, there is a sort of quote unquote desire to become conscious, a desire that eventually materializes only after you have a nervous system. So until you have a nervous system that allows you to make representations of events either inside or outside, you don't have the possibility of having a reflection, a possibility of having a mind that could think through those events. But that doesn't mean that the intelligence and the intention of having those elements is not there in the living creature. And this is, again, very, very important because we're talking about living creatures that are quite distinct from the creatures that we now have around us and that attract so much attention, that are made by AI, and that include, for example, things like chatbots that people are very astonished by because they appear to be thinking and doing things on their own, which they're not. And they're not because they actually don't have life in themselves, nothing like it. They don't have a possibility of mind. They don't have a possibility of consciousness in the sense that we do. So they are very, very different creatures, and this puts them in a completely different category. But the problematic thing is that many people see them as creatures. So while I'm very concerned with having life be respected, whether it is life in a single cell organism or life in a multicellular complex organism like a human being, or in general, a bird or a mammal, I am not concerned at all with what happens to these other creatures that we are inventing, because they are non-living. They have no possibility of sentience. They have no possibility of feeling. They have no possibility of suffering, which is the critical issue here.
If I might, yeah, I think it's kind of a sort of an interesting point in history, right, that we have this sort of explosion of interest in artificial computing intelligences, right at the same moment that we're witnessing this sort of wholesale ecocide and loss of biodiversity, particularly for the higher, for the more complex animals, the mammals and whatnot. So, you know, it's sort of interesting that both these kind of impinge on that same question, you know, which side are we on? We make these simulacra to act like us and look like us and respond like we want them to respond, but they're not responding from an emotional sense. You know, a robot will never, an android will never be able to tell you if they like a picture. They could say it, but they're never going to feel what it's like to, that biological feeling of, wow, that's a beautiful picture. So again, we're much more like you know, snails than we are robots, but we built these simulacra for people to respond to them, to fall in love with them, to become best friends with them, to rely on them. So it is an interesting moment. These processes are, I would say, somewhat linked. You know, are we Earthlings or are we not? Where do our loyalties lie? There's something else I'd love to pick up on. Professor Damasio said this sort of about the simpler creatures sort of wanting to become, desiring to become conscious. And it reminded me of, I've been so inspired by octopi, and because they're a mollusk and yet they're a very intelligent mollusk. So intelligence has been selected for among the mollusks and among the mammals. And so it's not the same line, but in both lines, intelligence and consciousness has been selected for. So I think that's sort of interesting too, to see that this, there are some evolutionary advantages to being more and more intelligent and more conscious. So it's interesting to see that that's, you know, true for all of life, not just for, you know, the hominids or something.
Right. The advantages of intelligence are quite obvious. So the maintenance of life in an organism that is in fact not conscious and that cannot decide by itself on doing A or B is that it provides you, it's like an insurance on the maintenance of life. And of course, as organisms get to be more and more complex, there's this magic moment in which consciousness really appears, and it appears when you have a possibility of making your deliberation. So, for example, take one of those feelings that is in fact the vehicle for consciousness. I like to say that feelings, homeostatic feelings, the ones that I talked about early on, things like breath and the heartbeat and temperature and hunger and thirst and desire and pain and itch, all of those are homeostatic feelings because they all represent something that is going on in our organism. And what is so interesting is that when they first appeared, what they immediately give is a chance of prolonging the prospects of your life on your own deliberation. So if you have pain right now, you are given an opportunity to do something about it. And if you are hungry right now, you're given an opportunity to do something about it. And now you are fully conscious of it. Now you have, and what that full consciousness, as opposed to your mollusk that may be hungry and eats what appears in the vicinity, with you have a much larger array of possibilities that you can pick from, so that you will be more likely to find an effective solution to your life problem of the moment. So the expansion from automatic pursuit of life to the conscious pursuit of life is the increase in possibilities that you have, and the possibility of even creating a solution that did not seem to appear. That's what consciousness really gives us. And of course, once again, and I'm so glad we agree on that, the creatures that we are inventing in the world of AI have nothing of the sort. That's inert material. They are not at risk for dying. Unless you take a hammer to them and destroy them, they're going to stay. And this is, of course, not at all what happens with bacteria or with your mollusks, or with a bird or a fish, for example. I'm always very astonished when people, the other day I heard a conversation where somebody asked, are fish conscious? And well, no, fish are very simple organisms. Of course, they're not conscious. And have you ever seen a fisherman getting a fish out of the water on the hook, and how the fish contorts itself trying to get away from the hook, and revealing quite clearly to anybody's open eyes and brain that you are seeing suffering, you're seeing pain, the results of pain, and that creature is in fact quite conscious of the pain that it's having right at that moment. But these worlds, it's very important that we make a distinction. The world of AI and the world of the living are very different worlds.
And is that a sort of an irony that here we are supposed to be that intelligence is going to make it easier to stay alive, right? That's kind of the point of intelligence, evolutionary speaking. And yet, here we are so intelligent that we are destroying life on Earth and a great deal of the possibility for our future, while we seem so fascinated with AI or androids or other sort of simulacra that appeal to our social needs and desires.
Yeah.
Is there an irony to reach the limit of useful intelligence, or?
You're quite right. It's an irony, and it's astonishing when I see the concern for the new AI developments. It just comes from a complete misunderstanding of what. Take the chatbots. The fact that you have access to a huge amount of knowledge, basically they have access to all the knowledge that's there on the web, and they manipulate it according to certain intelligent programs. Of course, on the first, if the questions are of a relatively simple nature, you can come up with interesting answers. But in fact, you also have a chance of getting complete gibberish and getting things that are completely wrong, because again, you don't have this surveyor of our mental space the way that we have. So there's no super intelligence there that can solve the problems of these machines. And I have respect for these machines. I actually have respect for the people who created them, and I'm not denigrating it. You know, I want I want them to stay and be useful, but let's not get to be romantic and sentimental about these poor devices and what can happen to them. I don't want to give them a status in our society.
But I think we will. People are already getting romantic and about these devices, because that's what we built them for. We built them to respond to our biological needs, right? As Homo sapiens sapiens. So they're going to be better friends than your real friend, or better lovers, you know, this sort of thing. But they're not people, right? They're not us. They don't really care about you, even if they say they do, because they can't feel that.
They cannot even care for themselves.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the future of consciousness. But both of you have talked about how consciousness is rooted in the history of life on Earth, and now you're sort of talking about the present artificial intelligences that we're living with and dealing with now, like ChatGPT. But I wonder what you both think about the far future of consciousness. You know, are you saying that it's impossible for a non-living creature to ever develop some kind of consciousness? Or what? I mean, Tok, you have written a lot about posthumanism. What does posthumanism mean, and where do you see us going?
Posthumanism is sort of a general philosophical thread, or a corrective, I guess you could say. It questions what we mean when we say human, because that has been this overarching principle that, you know, humanity is completely different than other animals, than machines. And so posthumanism is questioning the humanism part. What is it to be human? And that's both the animal turn and animal studies that are really reverberating throughout the academy. You know, dolphins give each other personal names, right? There's a lot of culture that is not just in Homo sapiens sapiens. And then the other side of posthumanism is this sort of interest in AI, you know, going into even transhumanism, this sort of rhetoric or belief that people should be able or could be able someday to upload their consciousness to a digital environment and therefore achieve immortality. I don't see this as a very likely thing for exactly the reasons that we've been talking. I'm not saying it's impossible that they could develop some kind of adaptive machine that cares about themselves sometime in the future, but we're not there yet. We certainly haven't seen that there yet. What we do see, though, is that, you know, this is impacting how people are thinking, how people think about themselves, how people think about other people. This is all being radically informed now by these artificial intelligence things. And androids too. Like, why put artificial intelligence in a human-looking robot? So that we respond to them as if they were one of our own species, you know, so that we develop emotions with them. That's the only reason we make them look like us.
Well, I think that the Jonas's question is interesting. We can do, you know, I'm perfectly capable of thinking of systems that would increase the amount of information an artificial organism, quote unquote, has about itself, and imbue that organism with a bit of vulnerability that would generate something that is like the responses that you have coming from human consciousness. But it's not going to be the same thing. It's not going to be the same thing precisely because there is no fundamental vulnerability, which is the vulnerability of the life process. When any cell, any living cell that has existed in the universe until now and that exists now comes with a certificate that gives it a certain number of hours or days or months or years of life. That's it. And so there is a beginning, there's a birth, there's a middle life, and there's a death point. And this is, of course, not the way artificial machines are designed. They can technically live forever, depending on the age of the materials. But even there's no death of the material. You know, when you take a 747 and you send it to be dismantled, there's no bit of the 747 that is going to be crying out and saying, "Help me! You're killing me." You know, the entire thing is going to be chopped into pieces, and none of those pieces are imbued with life, which is about risk, which is about growth and death and sickness too, which is very important. So I don't think.
Antonio,
Please.
Tok mentioned the possibility of downloading one's consciousness into a machine to live forever. Is this something that is just pure science fiction fantasy, or is it possible for us to achieve that kind of technology one day?
I don't think that we could achieve that. I think you can. I don't have any problem with the idea that we will be able to download tons of information. The problem is the system into which we're going to download that information. Those systems exist already, so you can put plenty of information on a system of computers, but that doesn't mean that you're going to that is going to be equivalent to what our mind is. You're going to be able to put information there and pull it out. We already do that quite efficiently, but it is
Also,
not. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say also that, we get this question of ontology, like we're going to upload me. Well, what is this me? For example, one thing I like to think about is that I try to eat yogurt every day, probiotic yogurt. Studies have shown that if you do, these little organisms that live in your gut help calm you down and reduce stress. And the days that you don't have it, your stress level goes up. It's a very clear study. So, if I'm sitting here and I'm not that stressed, I think, oh, I'm thinking this, but what is this meat? It includes those little guys in my gut. It includes, a lot of the stuff in this meat bag that we're walking around with. Most of it is not human DNA. And so when I say that I act like a certain thing, again, who is this me? And how could I upload these guys to the cloud with me? I don't think we could.
No, you're right. I agree.
We have some really interesting questions coming in from the audience that I'm going to start feeding to you, because I think they're going to fit into the conversation really well. As we start to move towards consciousness in artificial intelligences, to the extent that that is possible, how do we really know if a non-living system or even a living system is conscious? How do we develop is it possible to develop a kind of Turing test that tells us for sure whether another being is conscious, and will it be important for us to do that?
These things are simulacra, so we can program them to say whatever you want them to say, but they're not going to feel in the same way that we do. And if you want to call that consciousness, again, that's kind of up to you what you want to do with that word. But how Homo sapiens sapiens experience consciousness is part and parcel of biological life on Earth.
Right. No, I think that for me that the test always starts with feelings. I think that homeostatic feelings are the inaugural events of consciousness, and they are the test of whether some creature, some organism is conscious or not. So if that organism has a feeling, which basically could be the feeling of comfort or discomfort, of malaise or well-being, if that's there in a way, I was going to say in a palpable way, then it's conscious. And if it's not there, if there's no indication that there is that element of potential suffering or potential joy and pleasure, then it's not conscious.
So this is a related question from Jean. Might it be possible that our species is defining consciousness in such a way that dismisses the experiences of organisms that are not the same as us? And I would like to expand that to just get you each to talk about, what some of the ethical considerations are as we start to deal with other organisms and artificial intelligences that might be having something like experiences. Do we have to start to worry about what their feeling is and how we treat them? Tok is killing all these bacteria every day in his gut. Is that okay?
I think it's high time that we worry. Of course, we have started worrying already, which is good. But we certainly, when we're dealing with living species, there's every reason why we should worry about what we do. Now, obviously, we're not going to be able to worry about single-cell organisms in his gut or in mine, Going there is actually, you could be worrying about the organisms in your gut, but you might actually be doing harm to yourself by worrying about the organisms in your gut. So, it's really fantasy land when you start thinking about that. But there are plenty of organisms around us, and it's actually quite remarkable that in just a few decades we've gone from being, insensitive creatures like Ernest Hemingway going on safari in Africa and killing as many animals as he could and being proud of it, to actually being ashamed of doing something like that. So there's been an enormous progress, and that's the kind of progress that I hope can be extended even to Tok's octopuses. And so that's fine. With the machines, I'm not worried at all. I think my new car has got so many automated systems that give me trouble already to cope with them, that I don't want to worry about their life or their well-being. I want them gone if possible.
It is going to be, the ethics of AI, it's going to be tricky. It's already tricky. Like you talk about driverless cars. Well, if the driver, even if that's the AI, have to make ethical decisions, right? You're going to wipe out and you get to kill, you're going to either kill 3 old people or 1 baby. Which is it, right? So these are ethical decisions and dilemmas. And now we're saying that the AI is supposed to learn those. And the AI certainly are being a part of our social network. So it's going to be, there's a lot of ethical questions. Are these things, when we get androids, they're going to just be slaves? Can you beat your android? If you can beat your car, I guess, nobody's going to really object. But if you beat your android and it looks like a person, and the android on the street is saying, please, Bob, don't beat me, and you're standing there watching that, that's going to be very difficult for you to witness. There's a lot of ethical, where are the ethics in that? Maybe they can't feel, but I'm going to feel it if you're mistreating something that looks like a human being. What about sex robots? Some people are saying, oh, this is great, this will be wonderful, help people with disability, blah, blah, blah. Other people are saying this is horrible, this is going to be. So what are the ethics? Do they have ethical claims? Regardless of whether they feel, we're going to feel for them. And so they're going to be a part of those ethics. And then actual organisms, yeah, right. We'll look at the travesty, the whaling industry. Look at the amount of data coming out of non-human consciousness is astounding, from all sorts of species, even plants and forests and fungi, and honeybees actually learn how to do the little dance from other honeybees. I just read this a couple of days ago. Just keeping up with these developments is astounding, and it's a reminder of how much we have denied them their agency in the past. When I went to college, you couldn't talk about animal feelings. You said you're anthropomorphizing. It was forbidden. So we didn't even allow these very complex organisms to have feelings for the most part. So that's been a sea change in just the last few years. And we have to sort of admit that. So what are the ethics, right? If these things are other sort of ethical agents, if we are we enmeshed with the ethics with other animals? A lot of people would now say yes. The idea of animal rights is not now, it's a kooky idea, or environmental rights. Personhood has been granted to rivers and to dolphins and to various other things around the place. So yeah, the ethics of this are all very, very unclear. And again, that's why I get inspired by non-Western discourses, because Western discourse has been really very, very influenced by this categorical split between man and everything else for a long, long time. And that's simply not true with other discourses.
So actually, Tok, we have a question from Paulette that is directly about that. What are the differences between the Western and Eastern concepts of consciousness, and do they differ significantly?
I'm not an expert on Eastern philosophy. I would have to defer that. I could say a little bit about Native American, and then if you look at the Native American ideas of consciousness and even their mythologies and their religious cosmologies, their worldviews, if you will, they emphasize connections rather than differences. So their stories are about, very often, other animals and their connections to people, other organisms and plants and their connections to people. And with that, the ethics in Native American traditions include non-human actors. So you're always in an ethical web with other forms of life. It's not to say you don't kill them and eat them. In general, we do. Life feeds on life. But it comes with a set of ethical requirements that you really don't see in Western culture in the same way. And that's built into that way of thinking about consciousness.
Interesting. So how is it in those cultures that you accommodate the sense of responsibility and respect for that other life with the fact that you're going to eat it for breakfast?
Yes, well, it's a great question. That's sort of the theological tension in a lot of Native American traditions. And the thing is, for Native Americans, do whales have souls or do reindeer have souls? Yes, but they're still going to, kill that kobu and eat it. But what that means is that you're involved in this very cosmological, ethical relationship. And like, for example, you're killing something with the soul, so you've got to pray for its afterlife. You've got to ensure that you use it all respectfully. I've hunted with both native groups and non-native, and it can be the same sort of hunt, but with non-natives, it's a purely mundane activity. You're getting food for the freezer, you shoot the animal, you leave the rest for the squirrels. No, in native traditions, you have to pay funeral respects. You have to pray for them. You have to promise to use everything, and you would never take it all. Like you would never take all the berries from a bush. You want to leave that bush with some berries, and so it sets up a different way of managing one's relationship with other life.
Right. Interesting. Yep. Very good.
Here's an interesting question from the audience. We all have art behind us, and as artificial intelligence gets more sophisticated, what is the future of art, and what is the future of storytelling, given the ability of artificial intelligences to produce art or art-like products?
Cyber art tends to use people art
Sorry.
for their inspiration, don't they? I mean, they sort of scour the work of other artists and put something together. And same thing with, if you ask Alexa to tell you a story, she doesn't really come up with a story. She sort of scours stories that have been generated by people. So I don't think that the people almost going to go away. I don't think AI is going to be creative in that same way, but our culture is going to continue to be influenced by AI. And already you can see that happening.
Yeah, you already have examples of art that has been very much influenced by AI, but of course there will be art created by AI by itself, with given of course the appropriate setting and prompts. But I agree with Tok. I don't think art is going to go away, and I think having a certain degree of interaction between the new modalities of communication, for example, the new capabilities that they bring, and one's own inspiration and artistic tradition, I think that just makes the world richer. So I don't see any problem with that.
It's an interesting side question. Can AI copyright its art? And this has been addressed differently in different courts. In the United States, no. In China, I believe, yes. And then there's a related question. What about animal artists? There's been several examples. Can animals own art? There's a big court case. Can the monkey own the selfie it took? So you're asking both the same questions, right? Copyright is supposed to be invested in a person. Well, what counts as a person anymore?
One of our audience members, Maturi, has asked, are there levels of consciousness? And if there are, is the consciousness of humans somehow superior to that of other species?
It's interesting. So, of course, there are levels of consciousness in individuals, such as ourselves, and there are levels of consciousness in general. Actually, that's quite interesting. When you think, let's go back to this bit of information that I gave at the start. In my current physiological perspective, consciousness emerges with feeling. So the moment you have a feeling of any kind, because we're having feelings continuously, there's no moment where we don't have feelings unless you are in deep sleep or you are under anesthesia. By the way, think of this marvelous thing. One of the experimental ways in which you suspend consciousness in a totally controlled manner is anesthesia. And what anesthesia does is literally, quote unquote, freeze the physiological process in such a way that you no longer can know that you exist. And of course, that's very important. The reason why anesthesia was developed is because one of those very, very important homeostatic feelings called pain. If you are subject to pain, you're not going to have surgery because you're not going to cut yourself or allow anybody to cut into yourself because the pain is going to be horrendous. And that's why anesthesia is such an interesting experimental setting for the study of consciousness. But clearly, once you have that inaugural feeling, you have consciousness, and I would say you have consciousness 100%. What very often people think of in terms of levels of consciousness is the amount of knowledge that you bring into the conscious moment. So it is one thing to be alive and conscious and not thinking deeply about the problems that we are thinking, for example, right now. We are in this conversation. Somebody from the outside would say, well, these people have a very sophisticated level of understanding of consciousness because they're bringing in all of these comparisons with different species, with non-living creatures that can operate intelligently and so forth. So there's a way in which levels of consciousness can be conceived by the kind of field that they take in. And that, of course, is very different across individuals and across human situations. But then you also have levels of consciousness that have to do, for example, with the coming of sleep. Once you are sleepy, your level of consciousness begins to be dampened, and you begin to not respond to certain kinds of stimuli, especially in your periphery. And eventually you fall into sleep, which is a way of suspending consciousness quite naturally. It's not like anesthesia, but in a way it operates in very comparable ways. So there are, the answer to your to the question is that yes, there are levels of consciousness, even if you could say that basically you either are conscious or not, once you have or not access to feelings that clearly place you in a certain setting in relation to your life, and it's very important. You know, so much of our discussion today is about the contrast between creatures that have life versus creatures that don't. We obviously do, and plenty of other animals, and then there are the creatures like the AI organisms, quote unquote, that don't have life. And it's very important because the way we become conscious is by having a process called feeling that is representing mentally some of the characteristics of the process of being alive. That's quite critical. And the way in which it operates, and this is a way in which our science, talking about human neuroscience and neurobiology, have gotten a purchase on how this operates. This really operates because of the peculiarities of the system in ourselves, but it's called interoception. So we have, in general, we can divide our perceptions of the world in three categories. Exteroception, right now I'm looking at a screen where you guys are, and I can see you, and I can see the rest of my study here, and that's exteroception. The object is there, my nervous system, through certain portals, is taking in information and putting it together in the form of a percept. We also have percepts of one part of our interior, which is related to our joints, our bones, our muscles, which is proprioception. And then we have this marvelous world of so-called interoception. And interoception is about all the nerve endings that are in every nook and cranny of our organism. And they are picking up information about the state of the flesh. So it's not about the state of the skin or about the state of our retinas. It's about the state of interior organs, in the thick of those organs. And we're representing and pulling together all of this information in components of the nervous system. What is very interesting, and this is new, what is very interesting is that this process is not one of collecting information from the outside in the same way that I collect information visually from the outside, but it's also a way of regulating internally. So as I feel, for example, the state of my gut, the interior system is already responding to what has been picked up and has a way of adjusting to the situation. So this is not interoception, is not pure perception, is about perceiving and regulating life internally. And what we have, and what we call consciousness in us humans for certain, is the process of perceiving this state of struggle and regulation for life maintenance. So we're not just perceiving the interior, which, by the way, is how I described it the first times I described this when I started working on this subject. It's a way of describing the struggle for the maintenance of life within your organism. That is what consciousness really is today, as far as I can see.
Yeah, if I could address that question as well. The question said something about, are there different levels of consciousness, and humans have superior levels? And I'm always sort of worried about putting things in a direct hierarchy. And I know that right now it's easy to look around and be very sort of impressed by what humans have managed to do. We have iPhones and computers and Zoom, but that's not really what makes us us. There's plenty of hunter-gatherers. We spent most of our time as hunter-gatherers. There's still hunter-gatherers out there. They're fully as human as I am. But they don't have all these accoutrements. And then there's a lot of other intelligences out there that we've just sort of stumbled on. And so what is the dolphin's interior world? We don't really know. They talk. They say things to each other. We don't quite know what they're saying. What is the interior world of a whale? We don't know. We have aesthetic reactions to what we sense, but other things sense other things. Ultraviolet light, perhaps. Maybe that makes them pleased or unhappy. We don't have that sensation. So, but the other, and then we were talking about different states of consciousness within people, and Professor Damasio mentioned sleep and anesthesia, and I would just add on to that these purposeful ones like trance or transcendental meditation or these altered states of consciousness that people seek. And in fact, there's a new study out that gorillas like to spin themselves around to get dizzy to sort of experience that altered state of consciousness. So this is very interesting. We find it in many, many societies around the world. Shamanism is built on this, and that's a cornerstone as well of the animistic world. So people are very interested in different levels or different styles of consciousness. And again, we've been even seen that demonstrated at least in the great apes. So we may not be alone in that.
Yep.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. And there's one that I think leads very nicely from what Tok just said, which is a question about psychedelics. And there's a lot of new research on the neuroscience of how psychedelics work. This is a topic that touches both neuroscience and anthropology, so I think it's an interesting one. How do both of you think that psychedelics like psilocybin or LSD can be used to help further our understanding of the nature of consciousness? And let's start with Tok so you can continue from where you left off.
Yeah, I'm going to build just a little bit after what I sort of ended with, because I was talking about altered states of consciousness and, shamanism. So sometimes traditional shamans will use psychedelics, but not always. And so the shamanism is pretty much the same, whether they use psychedelics or not. It may be colored a bit differently, but that's not sort of at the core of it. But again, we're not alone in trying to change our states of consciousness through use of other chemicals. We see other animals engage in this too. Birds get drunk off of berries and seem to enjoy the experience. I've seen them staggering around my yard. So clearly these do shake up some of our states of consciousness. And I think, there's been encouraging results from some trials that this can have therapeutic benefits, helps a lot with PTSD or other sort of things. I'm not enough of a neurologist to talk about the neurological reactions, but certainly this is something that has been seen in many, many cultures throughout the world and have made use of it in different ways.
And Tony, do you have any feeling about whether psychedelics can be used to understand the neuroscience of consciousness?
Sure. I mean, it's more information about the specific effect of certain specific molecules, and that's I don't think it's a main avenue for the understanding of human consciousness or consciousness in general, but it's important information and can give you if you can find certain correlations between a certain chemical with a certain dose and a certain effect, it's more information that comes your way, which can be useful in a variety of ways, can be useful to understand the basic problem, can even have therapeutic applications. So it's definitely something to be done.
Great. So in the last just couple minutes, I just wonder if there's anything else that you two would like to say that our questions haven't directly gotten to, that you'd like people to be thinking about when they think about consciousness. Antonio?
Well, I think that people ought to realize that this is a very old question. It's a very old question that comes repeatedly. In our own time, for example, we've had one way of posing the problem of understanding consciousness called the hard problem of consciousness, which was posed by a British philosopher, David Chalmers. And one thing we can say is that today we have an answer to the hard problem of consciousness as posed by Chalmers. And that's very important. So we have ways of answering physiologically that issue that was considered an insolvable problem. So I think that's good news. And why we know thanks to research, which is of different disciplines, but is solidly based in biology, solidly human as well, because we want to, for something like this, we can get information from animals, but the human is going to be the critical experience creature. And so I think this is good news. And what we're going to reveal in the next few years of research about consciousness and related problems is, I think, very important and has consequences for how we see humans and has consequences for a variety of fields. So I think it's a good moment, actually.
Tok, a final word?
Well, just as an anthropologist, again, I would say that when we look at these words and what we mean, we're looking at a great deal of our own sort of cultural background. So it's going to be sort of reflective about that and to understand different cultures and different ways of looking at things. And even just talk about consciousness, we should be aware that with the ongoing ecocide we've destroyed so much consciousness in the last few years with entire species going extinct and whatnot. So just as we're beginning to understand these ideas of animal culture and animal mentalities, we have yet to really, I think, grapple with these at a sort of fundamental philosophical level. I'm going to echo Graham Harvey, a philosopher, called for an academic animism of thinking. Now that we know these things feel and think and are conscious, what does that mean for rethinking things like the humanities or anthropology or these very words that are built in very often to our Western systems of thought?
Great. Thank you both so much, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I hope everybody watching did as well. So thank you to everyone who organized this and to both of you.